Hello everyone. It's been a while since I've ranted, so here we are. I want to preface this particular rant with two things. First off, obviously, in case I wander over something that upsets you personally, trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about relationships, sort of, indirectly. Um, you'll see what I mean in a minute. But if the conversation makes you upset in some way, walk away, obviously. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about single people and the quote unquote problem of single people. Now, I'll be referencing it as a problem throughout this rant because that is the rhetoric used in this particular conversation, but personally, I don't see this as an issue because it doesn't affect me personally. If you're happy being single, be single. If you are unhappy being single, try to find a nice normal relationship and, be normal. But on to the main point with that out of the way. Now, I mentioned I was going to be talking about relationships and single people. Well, I want to talk very specifically today about a genre of content that I've been getting for the better part of this year, the lonely single man content. Yes, the lonely single man content. I'll get into the problems with that in a bit. But I've been getting this recently, and I'm not quite sure how I wound up on this algorithm. It's not just TikTok, but also YouTube. I've been getting a lot of this stuff. I'll make some references to that in a bit. But I've been getting this kind of content on both TikTok and YouTube. Definitely more heavily on TikTok, but I've also been getting a lot of news articles on this. Now, you don't know this, which you're about to, but every day, twice a day, once in the morning and once in the evening, I run through recommended headlines for me based on my searches. I've never before searched up single man anything. I don't search up anything along those lines. Nevertheless, I've been getting articles every once in a while throughout this year talking about the problem of being single and this, that, and the other thing single. Now, for reference, yes, I do happen to be single, but this is by choice. I tried a couple of relationships in college, always chose solitude. It's pretty obvious, you consistently choose solitude, you don't want a relationship. So I've stopped trying. And I'm totally happy with that. And I'm not the only one either. I'll also get into that in a bit. But yes, I am single by choice because I just like being alone. Okay? So while technically, yes, I am single, I am not lonely. I have never been lonely in my life. I'm fairly blessed that way. I just don't get lonely. Now, again, to reiterate, this is not to say that those who want a relationship are somehow in the wrong, nor am I going to be saying that those who are single are also somehow wrong. Nobody's wrong. Pursue the relationship status you particularly want. But a lot of this content is construed at lonely single men, and a lot of this I feel, and based on some light research, I'm pretty confident is disingenuous. See, when I started getting this content, I was like, okay, that's fine, I like videos talking about men's mental health. I'm a man. I have mental health problems. I like this, The conversation needs to happen. Great. I support this. Okay, so it's probably connected to that. But then more of it started happening, even though I wasn't liking the lonely single man content, nor was I necessarily watching it, right? It would appear, I would skip over it, but it kept happening. So I'm like, what is this? My second reaction, not my knee-jerk, but my second reaction was, well, there must be a lot of this content flooding the space, because that would explain why this is getting recommended to me so much, even though I'm not even liking this content that is coming at me. And this made sense, but then I think maybe 2 weeks of that thought process, I wondered why there was so much of that flooding my social medias. Why suddenly is there so much lonely single man content? What changed? So I decided to poke around and do some research. Now, I've been looking into this on and off since September, and I've found some very interesting things. First off, I've noticed that this conversation about single people, is almost exclusively directed at men. There is the occasional mention of lonely single women. In fact, I had to go out of my way to enter that algorithm, to be honest. But from a mainstream media perspective, because there's a lot of articles on this subject there as well, and also from a content creation perspective, there is so much of it aimed at men, very specifically. Lonely, single, straight men. Now, the straight men isn't necessarily spelled out, but the fact that nearly all of this, I would say with confidence, 98% of this content is directed at men can't find girlfriends, right? Men are afraid to approach women, or what is actually a truer statement, men aren't approaching women, right? A lot of this is men can't find women, basically, which implies heterosexual. I'll talk about that specifically, but I want to get into the sort of main point here. Now, this immediately created a logical issue in my mind because, approximately speaking, now this isn't specifically true, but roughly speaking, the population of America is approximately 50-50 men-women, right? I know the actual percentages are a little different. I think it's 50-some-odd% men and 40-some-odd% women, but it's close enough where we're not having some kind of major discrepancy in the numbers of men and women, right? So it's an approximate 50-50. So why aren't we talking about the lonely single women? And when I went to look for lonely single women, I found a very distinctly different focus for that content. Now, there is content about lonely single women, but the difference is the breadth of that discussion. Lonely single men content is, generally speaking, in most cases, talking about men in general, right? Oh, men can't find girlfriends. Men aren't getting into relationships. Men aren't doing all these things. Okay. But then when I went to the lonely single women content, what I found is I can't find a boyfriend. I'm lonely and single. I'm embracing cats because I can't find a boyfriend. Right? It's very individual. It's not applicable to women in general. Or at least, let me rephrase that to be even more hyper-specific. It is not being applied to women in general, despite the fact that based on the now vast quantities of lonely single women content that I get on my algorithms now, having done this research, and I can't get out of this algorithm. Please send help. Anyways, back to the point. Despite the large amounts of this content that does exist, nearly all of this lonely single women content is self-referential. It is talking about the woman individually. Furthermore, in the lonely single men content, there are women out there who are talking about this as well, but there are no men talking about the prevalence of lonely single women. Now, you might have differing views on that, but this seems unbalanced to me, right? I have seen quite a number of videos and articles written by women about lonely single men. I have not seen a single man talk about the prevalence of lonely single women. Okay? Now, we've established this discrepancy. Another thing that occurred to me is, if you were really concerned about lonely single men, why aren't we talking about lonely single gay men, right? Because think about this as well. You can very clearly tell what political angle a piece of content is aiming for in this space, in the lonely single men content. Because each side of the political spectrum points the finger at some specific aspect of culture that is causing men to be lonely and single. Let me give you the generalized view. Now, this doesn't apply to everything. There is politically neutral content talking about lonely single men, but the content that does have a political slant is very visible. More liberal-sided lonely single men content is generally going to point to toxic masculinity or male stereotypes as reasons why men aren't finding girlfriends. Okay, while that isn't going to broadly be true, it does make some sense, right? I can understand where male stereotypes would be a turnoff for a lot of women because a lot of that is damaging to the man's mental health and really inhibits his ability to emotionally connect. That makes sense, right? I can understand that. Then we go to the conservative side, where they point the finger at feminism. Men are afraid to approach women because they're afraid of being called a creep or scary or inappropriate or something like that. Also makes some sense. I can totally see some men being afraid of this particular idea, right? Of being afraid to approach women for fear of coming off as weird or creepy. I can understand that. Again, that I don't think that applies to the entire problem, nor do I think it applies to all the men, but I can definitely understand why some men would be afraid of this idea, right? So both sides definitely are pointing at a contributing factor, not the total thing, and I'm not really concerned about why men are single, right? That's not really the point of this rant. I'm just pointing out that each side is pointing to a different primary cause. Well, if we're talking about lonely single men, and we're talking about male stereotypes being one of the problems with men approaching women, or men finding girlfriends, actually, more specifically, why aren't we talking about gay men who are also sort of shoved into these stereotypes as well when they're young, before they've figured out they're gay, right? Because nobody really knows until they hit, like, puberty, right? And these male stereotypes are still pushed onto gay boys just as much as they're pushed onto straight boys, right? But despite this, and despite the then resulting logical conclusion that in a gay relationship both men must overcome these stereotypes to be able to connect emotionally, why aren't we talking about that? Right? And this is actually the question that got me started with this following train of thought. What if it's not about men, even? What if it's actually about birth rate? Now, this is partially a question that came about because I'm in finance, I like to read things about economies, and I know that first world countries have a stated problem with birth rates. I'm aware of this from my economic background. It's something that occasionally comes up in economic discussions. So that's how that occurred to me originally. So what I did is I went to look at America's birth rates, right, for the past 30-ish years, yeah. What I found is that ever since 2018, America's birth rates have been dropping to record lows. Record lows. Now, again, to reiterate, this doesn't personally bother me. I don't care. Right? I'm not a government. But I can understand why the government would be concerned about this. Right? I mean, think about it. You're a country, you're in charge of a group of people, and they're not having as many children as they used to, and they're not replacing themselves. How do I know they're not replacing themselves? Because the average birth rate for a couple, they specifically measure this by 1,000 women for some reason. It's actually, logically speaking, it's per couple, which is, I think, part of the reason why they're having a problem sort of analyzing the birth rate, but I suspect I know why. But anyways, theories aside, the average birth rate per couple is 1.7 births per couple. Now that sounds like an odd number for births, but what this essentially means is that most couples have 2 children, but some couples have 1 child. Now this is an average. Some couples have no children, some couples have more than 2 children. But the average is below 2. In order for the population to grow, that birth rate must be above 2 at least. Because think about it. A couple has 2 children. They're replacing themselves in the population. In terms of population numbers, they're only replacing themselves, maintaining the status quo. If they only have 1 child, then they're not even replacing themselves. Only one of them is being replaced in terms of population number. In order for a couple to contribute positively to birth rates, they must have more than 2 children. And so few people are having even 2 children that the average birth rate isn't even at 2.0. It's 1.7. So while a lot of couples are having 2 children, more and more couples aren't having 2 children. They're only having 1 child. Okay? That's fine. This is also why, despite the fact that a lot of people in their 20s, a lot of people I know from college, for instance, are, quote, having children, right? That is a common phrase. In fact, this is actually a very common phrase in the lonely single women content I was talking about earlier, where a lot of people, a lot of women more specifically, for some reason, I'm not going to speculate as to why, there's a variety of possible reasons, but a lot of the lonely single women, when they're talking about how lonely they are, one of the popular phrases in that space is, all of my friends around me are having children and getting married, and here I am, single AF, right? Or some variation of that sentence. Now, despite the fact that they say that all their friends are having children, and children and friends are plural, what isn't really being stated is how many children per couple are being produced there. My guess would be 1 or 2, on average. So, I mean, think about your own friend circle. I'm betting most of your friends who are in a relationship and have children, they probably only have 1, possibly 2 children. If they have 3 or more, that's unusual, according to the statistics. Okay? Great for them. If they want children, they can have them. But this was really being written about quite extensively last year, 2021. Late 2021. There was a lot of news articles on whether or not America is in trouble based on its birth rate, because it's been dropping consistently since 2018. Actually, it's been dropping consistently since 2007. It's just been breaking new records, right? So since 2007, America's birth rate has been declining, and now we're hitting record lows consecutively. Okay, great. That's fine. But what is a government to do? Ha ha! I'm glad you asked. Encourage media to talk about sad, lonely, single people. Another interesting thing that I found quite by accident, actually, in this research, and this was something I came across entirely accidentally, is the allegation that 50% of single people in the country are not interested in a relationship. Now, they claim that they used a random sample from across the nation, but they didn't provide how many people they actually asked, so I'm not going to necessarily claim that this is an accurate survey, but a lot of people seem to be using it, so a lot of people at the very least believe in this particular survey. And as a result, from a government and media standpoint, they're running on the assumption that 50% of all single people are simply uninterested in relationships. Okay. This is, again, from a government and media standpoint, since the media obviously is now getting pressured by government to talk about this, right? This is a problem. So now they start talking about how men aren't going to be, men aren't finding relationships, men aren't woohooing, to use the Sims term, right? Men aren't doing any of that. And they talk about, various potential causes and all this other stuff. I mentioned those briefly. But why the men? Well, my personal theory, and this is just a guess because I can't find diddly squat to prove this for the fairly obvious reason that literally no one's talking about it, but I suspect they're targeting the men because they don't want to try to backtrack on the strong feminist messages they were talking about several years ago. A lot of that content that they were creating several years ago, the 2010s, was talking about how women don't need men. I had that reversed in my head for some reason. Women don't need men. Women shouldn't be afraid of being single, etc. And I think they're targeting men so that way they don't walk that back by accident or through basically hypocrisy or logical fallacy. So that's why I think they're targeting men. This is, again, just a personal theory of mine. I don't have any evidence for this. This is just my personal belief based on how media rhetoric has been running the past decade. But back to the point. So they start creating all these articles on single people, right? And so well-intentioned people on YouTube and TikTok, they're going to be, they're going to be surfing the web. They're going to be reading articles. Of course, everyone reads news articles. And they're going to see this. And they're going to read this. And they're going to read these articles. Or just the headlines, is equally as common. And they're going to draw conclusions. Now, whether these conclusions are based in fact or not, that may or may not matter. It depends on how specific the Lonely Single Man content is going to get. But earlier I mentioned that a decent portion of Lonely Single Man content is women. And there is the accusation that these women are single and just looking for a guy. Maybe. Possibly. I don't know. I'm not in their head. I can't tell you. But both men and women are making content on this on TikTok and YouTube, and they're seeing these articles, and they're creating content about it. Right? Okay. So that's where all this content is coming from on TikTok and YouTube. We had an explosion of news articles talking about the subject that lasts to this day. Just a couple of days before Christmas, I saw 3 different articles talking about how to survive the loneliest season, which was kind of funny to me. But, this is still content being churned out by mainstream media every couple of weeks, pretty consistently. And just Google single people and then hit the news tab on Google. You'll be flabbergasted by how much there is. And have a blast with that. But they're reading this, they're creating content. Okay, that's where this is coming from. Great. But then I began seeing a different approach. Now, originally, earlier in the year, a lot of this content was talking about the cultural and social aspects of men being single and the problems, the causes, solutions, etc. Then I started seeing a new approach. Well, what I thought was a new approach, but upon research, not really. I saw articles talking about how being single is simultaneously better and worse for your finances. Now, this really intrigued me, because I'm, of course, a single dude, and I'm not having financial troubles. I don't have a house, which I'll get into in a little bit, right? I don't own my own home, and I don't care, I don't intend to. But we'll get to that in a second. So, a little bit before Christmas, I would say a week before Christmas, I began seeing articles talking about how this Christmas will be particularly profitable for a lot of businesses, a lot of companies, because there's more single people than ever, and rather than spending their money on dates and gifts for significant others, they're spending it on themselves. So luxury goods are at an all-time high in demand. Right? I saw 2 different articles for this. Yeah, I tried looking for these articles yesterday. Gone. These articles don't exist anymore. Well, they probably do somewhere on the internet, but I couldn't find them. They've been removed from easy search results. Okay? And I put in the specific headlines, too. Still can't find them. Then, 2 days ago, literally the day after Christmas, I discovered a video by one of the channels I follow How Money Works. I love this channel. Very good insight on finances. I like to listen to it when I'm doing other things because, of course, I'm in finance. I like to hear what other people have to say about finances. The title of this video was How Being Single is an Unaffordable Luxury. I might have slightly paraphrased that, but the title outright did say that single status is an unaffordable luxury in America. Being a single man and intending to be so for the remainder of my days, I was intrigued, as you can imagine. So I watched the video. Now, I noticed a very interesting thing in this video. The first half of the video, I completely agree with. The first half of the video discussed how a couple, a romantic couple, can split a majority of the common expenses and therefore lighten that financial burden on themselves individually. We're talking electric bill, internet, water bill, rent, or mortgage payments. They can split those. Okay, yeah. That's very true. Very true. 100% true. Totally agree with this. Then it switches. It starts talking about income. And the rhetoric changed. Now, How Money Works was talking about how married people make more money, approximately $5,000 more a year, maybe a little bit more depending on, a little bit more or less depending on your area, whatever. I think it was 5,000. It might have been a little bit more. I was not paying attention to the numbers so much as I was paying attention to the change in rhetoric, because suddenly it went from couple to family. That's a different word for a very specific reason. That is a change from a couple without children to a couple with children, at least one. So, the claim in this video was that married people make more money. But, on the other hand, because now we've introduced this, let's assume one child, now that we've introduced this child into the equation, that makes sense. Now, one of the things that really stood out to me was How Money Works said that one of the reasons why married people make more money is because they have a family to provide for, and now are willing to work longer hours to make that money. Think about it for a second. Now, I'm not denying this, right? I fully suspect that this is something that happens, right? I believe this. I've seen this happen in my personal life. I'm not arguing that point. What I'm pointing out here is that that very specific change. The married person is making more money because they're working longer hours. Therefore, they are more likely to be promoted, more likely to get a raise. And they're working longer hours because they want to make that extra money to fund their family. Now, how do I know that a child has been added, right? Family could mean a couple and they just consider themselves family, right? The problem here is that even a married couple with no children doesn't need to work longer hours to provide for the other one. Theoretically, both have a job, right? Most couples, most everyone has a job, right? Whether you're in a relationship or not, you probably have a job. There are rare exceptions to this rule, but rule of thumb is you've got a job, relationship or no. If you're both working, neither of you need to volunteer longer hours. You both have your own sources of income, right? You're also additionally splitting the living expenses of wherever you're living. So both of you have even more disposable income than a single person. Not by much, I'll grant you, but still. You both have a little bit of extra cash lying around and you're both working. But if you have a child, which is a hideously expensive proposition, now, because of how expensive it is to raise children these days, you are now very much both in need of more money. You have far less disposable income, right? Because think about very briefly, and I'm just going to point this out to emphasize the point, the hospital bill for actually going to the hospital and giving birth, grossly high number. Then you have minimum 18 years of feeding this child, including inflation costs, clothing this child, inflation costs, providing this child with entertainment, inflation costs, getting a larger living space, which I'll get back to in a minute. This is actually relevant to this longer conversation. Having enough living space to give the child their own room, including property price increases, right? Children are really expensive these days. More expensive than even a lot of working couples can afford. But that's how you know that this description, this conversation has changed the bar. It has moved the bar, right? It's moved the goalposts. That's the phrase I'm looking for. It's moved the goalposts. In the first half of the video, How Money Works was 100% talking about just two people in a romantic relationship, no children. Then, in the second half of the video, upon talking about people in a relationship, he was talking about specifically married people. That's fine. People in a relationship, or people married, make more money. That tone changed. The context changed. Now we have at least one child involved, because now we're talking about a family. Whereas, again, two people in a relationship with no children don't need to work longer hours. They both have their own regular incomes. Right? It's just something they don't need. But they do need it if they have a child. Now, I don't think that this was malicious by How Money Works. I'm pretty sure How Money Works, whoever's behind that channel, I don't remember their name off the top of my head. They saw articles, they read articles, they did some research. And so what I did is I did some research. And the same change in language that How Money Works had in the middle of that video, about the halfway point, also happens in a lot of articles and studies on income, right? We're talking about, here's single people splitting expenses. Here's married couples working longer hours and making more money for their families. The same change in terminology happens in these articles. So I think this was accidental by How Money Works, but at the end of the day, I'm here to stipulate that, no, being single is not an unaffordable luxury. Being a single parent is. I'll give you that. Being a single parent is a hideous financial strain for one person. But being a single childless person, zero issue. Right? The numbers are supporting this, if you pay attention to the actual numbers here. But more to the point, I just recently saw some articles talking about, and I actually also just listened to a video on this as well, talking about kidulting, where mainstream media is talking about how people in my generation aren't able to afford permanent housing because they're spending their money on hobbies. Thereby basically implying that if people stopped pursuing hobbies, they would be able to afford housing. Alright? The problem here is that, first off, there's a couple of things wrong with this argument. And I'll get into how this is connected in a hot minute. Permanent housing is not as important to my generation as it is for prior generations, right? The boomers were raised on the idea that it is part of the American dream to, have a family with the kids and the house and the car and all that other lovely nonsense. My generation has realized that the American dream died ages ago, and it's also not everyone's dream. So we don't care, basically. At least a majority of us don't. There are, I'm sure, some areas that do and some people that do, but most of us do not ascribe to the American dream either because it's not our personal definition, which is my case, or it's just something that people don't see as attainable, which is mostly true. Okay. But then why specifically talk about why people can't afford permanent housing, right? Why is that a problem? Well, people in permanent housing are more likely to have the room for kids. Apartments aren't really laid out with the intention of starting a family in them. There are a few, yes, but most apartments are really designed with one or two people in mind. Right? No kids. So, people who rent are just statistically less likely to try for a family, even if they're in a relationship. And as a result, it is rather concerning for a lot of people, or a lot of, let me rephrase that, I won't say people, a lot of media and the government, that people are perfectly fine renting. Right? A lot of people are uncomfortable with that. Also, a lot of people are living with their parents still. Nothing wrong with that. Right? If you have a good relationship with your parents, go for it. There's nothing wrong with that. But people living with their parents are also less likely to try to start a family because, again, they don't have the space for a family. Now, I'm not talking about accidental children here. That's a totally separate conversation. I'm talking about deliberately trying for a family, which is a different story altogether. People aren't going for that, right? And the media and the government would like to say that, well, it's because people aren't buying permanent housing. Well, they're spending all their money on hobbies instead of dates. Well, this and that. No. Well, okay, partially. But at the end of the day, more and more people are just uninterested in the dynamics of a relationship. Right? That 50%, the alleged 50% of single people not looking for a relationship bears that out. Mindsets have changed. Perspectives on relationships have changed. People aren't just going to get married for the sake of it. Right? I am one of these. I'm just not interested. And people like me who don't want any kind of relationship are increasing in number. And that's fine to me. And if you want a relationship, that is also fine. That is entirely your choice. That is your life, your choice, totally fine. No issues there. But at the end of the day, what we are talking about here is a very specific, concentrated media push, a long-term one. They haven't been spamming this huge volumes. They did initially at the beginning of the year, I suspect, because that's where I really began getting a lot of this, and that really caused a spur in content on social media for that, right? Because people, again, were reading these and creating this content, but at the end of the day, they've cooled off a little bit, and they just kind of try to remind us every once in a while, oh, you're lonely, you need a relationship. You need to have kids. You need a house for these kids. Go get a house. Stop having hobbies. Right? Now, this is just the conclusion I've come to based on what I've seen and how it's talked about. Right? Again, there's a variety of things here that are too coincidental. I also find it fairly interesting that Roe v. Wade was repealed, and more conservatives are getting onto the idea of inhibiting even birth control, which I find the timing of very interesting. I also want to briefly point out how long it takes manosphere content to get banned. Just an eyebrow raised there. I mean, how long was... I'm going to ask you a very specific question that I'm not going to give you the answer to. I want you to Google this yourself. How long was Sneeko on YouTube after he said consent wasn't real? Which is a very scary and dangerous line of thought, but how long was he on there after that? Go ahead, find out. It's out there. The answer is very easy to find. Just find the date of the video that he said that, and then find the date he was banned. I think you'll be surprised and maybe a little disturbed. because that is a very dangerous thing for anyone with his following to say. And he was not banned immediately after saying that. Okay? That's all I'll say on that subject. But it is eyebrow raising. I'm not gonna say anything more concrete than that, but yeah, chew on that. Have a nice day.